The first time they knocked on her door, it was a polite tap, firm, but not unfriendly. At the time, Helen Ward didn't think much of it. She had just come in from watering her peonies, hands still damp with morning dew, an old denim apron slung over her shoulders. She wasn't expecting company, but she figured it might be the mailman or perhaps one of the newer neighbors asking about composting again. Instead, when she opened the door, she found 3 people standing stiffly on her porch: a young man in a navy polo with an HOA badge, a woman with a clipboard, and an older gentleman whose expression resembled that of a funeral director forced to deliver bad news to someone he barely knew. "Mrs. Ward," the young man began, though it wasn't really a question. "I'm Derek Nelson, Vice Chair of the Greystone Pines HOA. This is Tanya Marsh, Board Secretary, and Mr. Langston, our legal consultant. We need to speak with you regarding an urgent matter of compliance." Helen blinked, then gave a slow, kind smile, the kind that had disarmed more than one overly confident young engineer back in the days when she chaired municipal development projects and negotiated federal water rights with a phone pressed between her shoulder and jaw. But here in Greystone Pines, she was just the quiet widow in the brick cottage at the dead end of Wren Hollow Court. The woman who brought homemade scones to the annual bake sale and planted tulips in the communal green without ever once asking for credit. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let them into her front sitting room, which still smelled faintly of lavender and fresh-baked bread. She poured tea while they unfolded diagrams and architectural sketches on her glass coffee table like missionaries laying out scripture. Derek did the talking. "As you may know, the HOA has finalized plans to extend Wren Hollow Court to connect with Foxhaven Lane. It's part of our 2026 Accessibility and Safety Initiative. This new connection will improve emergency access, reduce traffic congestion on Bramble Ridge, and increase the overall property value for all residents." Helen's eyes didn't waver as she listened, but something settled cold and heavy in her gut. She watched his mouth move, saw the diagram he gestured to with rehearsed enthusiasm. The new street would run straight through her front garden, through her parlor, through the old kitchen she and her late husband remodeled together on weekends after their retirement. Her home, the house she had owned for 30 years, was marked with a clean gray X. Tanya Marsh cleared her throat delicately. "Naturally, we'll compensate you at fair market value. You'll have 90 days to relocate once the demolition order is confirmed. We expect your full cooperation as a valued member of the community." Helen set down her teacup with the precision of a woman who had once used seismic stress data to halt a billion-dollar project until her calculations were taken seriously. She leaned forward, studying their faces, noting the subtle satisfaction in Tanya's eyes, the forced sympathy in Derek's, and the smug aloofness of Mr. Langston, who had yet to say a word. "I see," Helen said softly. "So you're not asking me. You're telling me." "It's standard procedure," Derek said quickly. "The HOA has full authority to designate redevelopment zones in accordance with the bylaws. You'll find it outlined in Section 7, Paragraph B." "I'm sure I will," Helen murmured. She rose slowly and walked to the bookshelf in the corner, where she kept the original title deed in a leather-bound file, along with city planning maps dating back to the 1940s. She ran her fingers over the familiar edges, the corners worn from being handled so many times over the years. "I'd like to review those bylaws in full before I give you any kind of answer," she said as she turned back toward them, her voice calm, but now lined with the kind of steel that made Derek shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You'll have my response within 3 business days." The trio stood to leave, with Mr. Langston offering his first and final words. "We expect no delays, Mrs. Ward. Resistance will only complicate matters." Helen walked them to the door with the same serene expression she had worn from the beginning, but inside, a storm was brewing. As the last SUV pulled away from her cul-de-sac, she exhaled through her nose and reached for her landline. She didn't call a lawyer. She called Raymond, her late husband's old partner in zoning and land use law, now retired but still sharp as ever. She told him everything in quiet, measured tones, and when she finished, he chuckled darkly. "Hell, Helen, I told you they'd come sniffing around eventually. That dead-end street, that was never city property. You still own it." "I thought as much," she said. "You've got the easement rights and the original road deed. If they want to build a road through your living room, they're going to have to pry it out of your cold, dead hands." No, Helen said, her eyes narrowing as she stared out the window toward the street that had never been theirs. They'll have to buy the whole damn road first. And I don't intend to sell. That night, Helen sat at her desk with a glass of whiskey and a stack of legal documents older than most of the current HOA board. She traced the route of the proposed road with a pencil, smiling as she realized just how badly they had miscalculated. They thought she was just a kind old woman in a cozy house at the end of a quiet street. They didn't know she was the last barrier standing between them and their precious expansion, and she wasn't moving an inch. Helen spent the next few days in a focused, purposeful silence, her mind whirring like the gears of an old, dependable machine as she sifted through decades' worth of paperwork. She had always been meticulous, a habit born from years spent managing multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, where a single missed detail could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Now, that same discipline and attention to detail had become her greatest weapon in the quiet war brewing between her and the HOA. She pulled out the original deed to her property, running her fingers over the brittle, yellowed pages as she traced the familiar words with her eyes. The house, a modest but solid brick cottage, sat on a half-acre lot at the dead end of Wren Hollow Court. But the key detail, the one that had always set her property apart from the cookie-cutter homes that had sprung up around her over the years, was the narrow strip of asphalt that extended from her front yard all the way to Foxhaven Lane. It was a remnant of a long-abandoned county road, one that had been decommissioned and sold to the previous owner decades before Helen and her husband bought the place. The HOA had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that the road leading to her property was public, part of the shared infrastructure that fell under their jurisdiction. But it wasn't. The road, like her house and the surrounding land, was hers and hers alone, a fact clearly documented in the old survey maps and title documents she kept neatly filed away in her basement. Helen smiled to herself as she flipped through the papers, her fingers lingering on the neatly typed paragraph that granted her exclusive rights to the road and the surrounding easements. It was a small, almost forgotten detail, the kind of thing that might have been overlooked by someone less thorough, less obsessive about record-keeping. But not Helen. She had always prided herself on her ability to see the big picture, to understand the complex web of regulations and legalities that govern the land she had spent her life shaping and protecting. Satisfied that she had all the documentation she needed, Helen picked up the phone and called Raymond again, her fingers tapping lightly against the old rotary dial as she listened to the slow, steady buzz of the line connecting. He picked up on the third ring, his gravelly voice warm and familiar as he greeted her. "Helen," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I figured you'd be calling me sooner or later. What have those HOA clowns gotten themselves into this time?" Helen chuckled, her voice low and steady as she leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly beneath her. "They want to run a road through my living room, Ray. They think they can just steamroll me into compliance, like I'm some frail old lady who doesn't know the difference between a right-of-way and a driveway." Ray snorted, the sound crackling through the line like dry leaves in a stiff wind. "Hell, they don't know who they're messing with, do they? You've got them dead to rights, Helen. That road is yours, clear as day. They can't touch it without your permission, and even then, they'd have to pay you a pretty penny for the privilege." Helen's smile widened, her eyes glinting with the same quiet, ruthless determination that had made her a legend in her field. "I know, but I don't want their money, Ray. I want them to learn a lesson, to understand that they can't just push people around because they have a fancy clubhouse and a stack of bylaws." Ray's chuckle deepened, his voice growing softer, almost affectionate, as he spoke. "You always did have a taste for the long game, didn't you? All right, what's the plan?" Helen leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly against the polished oak of her desk as she outlined her strategy. She would start by filing a formal cease and desist letter, backed up by the original property deed and survey maps that clearly established her ownership of the road. She would send copies to the HOA board, the County Planning Commission, and the local zoning office, ensuring that every relevant authority was fully aware of her legal rights and prepared to back her up if the HOA tried to escalate the situation. Next, she would reach out to her neighbors, quietly rallying support from the other homeowners who had grown tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and overreaching demands. She would gather signatures, file petitions, and lay the groundwork for a full-scale revolt if the board refused to back down. Finally, if all else failed, she would take the fight to court, using her decades of experience as an expert witness to systematically dismantle the HOA's case piece by piece, exposing their greed and arrogance for all to see. Ray whistled softly as she finished her outline, his voice tinged with admiration as he replied, "Damn, Helen. Remind me never to get on your bad side. You're going to tear them apart." Helen smiled, a slow, satisfied grin spreading across her face as she leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the framed photograph of her late husband that sat on the corner of her desk. "I don't plan to tear them apart, Ray. I plan to make them wish they'd never come knocking on my door in the first place." Over the next few days, Helen threw herself into the task with the kind of single-minded determination that had defined her career. She drafted letters, copied maps, and pored over county records, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she assembled the legal equivalent of a bunker, a fortress of paper and ink that would shield her from the HOA's demands and crush their flimsy arguments beneath the weight of cold, hard facts. When she finally finished, her desk was piled high with documents, her printer wheezing and sputtering from overuse, and her phone buzzing constantly with messages from Raymond, who had taken it upon himself to play devil's advocate, testing her defenses and probing for weaknesses like a general preparing his troops for battle. Satisfied that she had left no stone unturned, Helen gathered the thick stack of papers into a sturdy manila envelope, sealed it with a sharp, satisfying snap, and marched down to the mailbox at the end of her driveway. She dropped the envelope into the rusted metal box, her heart pounding with a fierce, quiet pride as she watched the red flag snap into place. As she turned to head back up the driveway, Helen felt a cold wind whip through the trees, rustling the dry, dead leaves that clung stubbornly to the branches overhead. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath steaming in the cold air as she whispered a single, defiant word into the empty, snow-covered street. Checkmate. By the time the HOA board received Helen's envelope, winter had fully blanketed Greystone Pines. The snow fell in slow, thick sheets, muffling the sidewalks and layering the cul-de-sacs in a pristine quiet that belied the storm Helen had unleashed beneath the surface. Her letter didn't scream. It didn't threaten. It simply laid out, in unflinching legalese and backed by concrete documentation, the facts. She owned the road, not the HOA, not the community. And under Municipal Code 12-614, as applied to privately owned thoroughfares that had never been ceded to county jurisdiction, no entity, public or private, could develop or modify the land without the explicit consent of the deed holder. The HOA's redevelopment initiative had been built on an illusion, and Helen had shattered it with a single envelope. Victoria Lang, the HOA president, sat alone in the clubhouse conference room with the letter spread before her like a battlefield map. Her manicured hands trembled slightly as she reread the key line for the third time. The undersigned retains exclusive ownership, rights of access, and full jurisdiction over Wren Hollow Court, extending to the intersection with Foxhaven Lane, as established under deed #8043, D and confirmed in supplementary filings 1988 through 2002. It was signed, notarized, and accompanied by aerial surveys and the kind of paperwork that made bureaucrats wince. It was also, unmistakably, devastating. She looked up as Derek Nelson entered the room, his cheeks flushed from the cold and the embarrassment of failure. He threw his coat over the chair and dropped a manila folder on the table beside her, his jaw clenched tight. The county clerk confirmed it. He muttered, not meeting her gaze. "We pulled everything she cited. It's legit. The street's hers. We can't build through it." Victoria exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a sigh and a growl. She had spent months pushing this road extension through. Promised connectivity. Promised security. Promised value. It had been her banner project, the initiative that would carry her from HOA president to a seat on the regional planning board. And now, it was unraveling because of a little old woman in a cardigan who made scones for bake sales and kept tulips in the median. Derek sat down, flipping through Helen's letter for the 5th time. You know the worst part? She didn't ask for anything. She didn't demand a buyout or threaten to sue. She just told us to back off and reminded us that we'd be trespassing if we didn't. Victoria leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She couldn't spin this. She couldn't charm it away in a newsletter or bury it in a footnote. Helen had checkmated them in the calmest, most precise manner possible, and now the board was exposed, not just to embarrassment, but to litigation. Already, murmurs were spreading across the community. Homeowners had begun asking questions, not just about the proposed road, but about other decisions the board had made in recent years: fines levied without hearings, architectural approvals granted to friends and denied to others, mysterious increases in HOA fees with no clear accounting. Helen's resistance had done something deeper than block a road. It had reminded people they weren't powerless. Victoria stood abruptly. "We need a strategy. Damage control. Call an emergency meeting. If we can't push the road through, we need to pivot. Reframe the initiative. Emphasize environmental preservation or historic status, or—" "No," Derek interrupted, his voice quieter but firmer than she expected. "We don't pivot. We admit we screwed up. We back off. And for the love of God, we stop underestimating Helen Ward." It was the first time he'd said her name with something other than condescension. Meanwhile, Helen herself sat at her kitchen table with a mug of strong tea, watching snow collect along the eaves outside. She had received no response from the HOA yet, no knock at the door, no letter, no groveling apology, but she could feel the shift in the air. The tension was palpable, not hostile exactly, but reverent in a way that made her laugh quietly to herself. She hadn't intended to become the village icon of resistance, but then again, she hadn't intended to let them walk over her either. The phone rang just after noon, its sharp bell breaking the stillness. She wiped her hands on a towel and answered. The voice on the other end was slow, practiced, and overly polite. "Mrs. Ward, this is Marcus Dillard. I represent the Greystone Pines HOA. I was wondering if we might schedule a time to meet in person. I believe we may have some reconciliation to discuss." Helen smiled faintly. "Of course, Mr. Dillard. I'm always happy to talk. Though I hope you've reviewed your client's previous correspondence before approaching again. I'd rather not waste time." Marcus chuckled nervously. "Understood. I assure you, we're approaching this conversation with fresh perspective." They met the next morning at the clubhouse, neutral ground, though Helen found the grand oak-paneled meeting room slightly absurd. The space was designed for real estate brochures, not real conversations. She stepped inside to find Dillard waiting with a briefcase and a brittle smile. Victoria was there too, her expression unreadable but her posture defensive, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Mrs. Ward," Dillard said, standing, "thank you for coming. We want to begin by acknowledging that the board acted prematurely in assuming development rights over Wren Hollow Court. After reviewing your documentation, it's clear your position is well-founded." "Appreciate the honesty," Helen said, sitting with slow grace. "What now?" Victoria's lips tightened, and Dillard continued. "We'd like to formally withdraw our road proposal and issue a community-wide statement clarifying that your property and the street are not within HOA development jurisdiction." Helen nodded slowly, waiting. "In addition," Dillard said, glancing at Victoria, "the board would like to propose a community recognition of the historic nature of your home and the roadway to be submitted for consideration by the local preservation society. You would, of course, have final say." A pause. Helen studied them. She saw the cracks, not just in the legal armor they once wore, but in their egos, their authority. They weren't here to make peace. They were here to surrender, carefully, behind a curtain of formality. "That's a start," she said. "But there's more." Victoria raised her eyebrows. Dillard leaned forward. Helen's voice remained calm. "I want it noted in the bylaws that Wren Hollow Court is not subject to HOA ordinances. No future board shall attempt to reassert control over it. And any map, brochure, or representation of the community that suggests otherwise shall be formally corrected." Dillard's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "I'll draft it myself." Helen stood. "Then we're done here." As she walked out of the clubhouse, snow crunching underfoot, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just victory, but vindication. Not just pride, but power. She had been underestimated, brushed aside, and assumed irrelevant because of her age, her gender, her quiet way of living. They had forgotten that the people who don't speak loudest often see clearest. That humility and intelligence, paired with quiet confidence, are the most disarming combination of all. And as she passed the freshly plowed stretch of Wren Hollow Court, sunlight glittering off the icy trees that lined her private road, Helen Ward smiled to herself, because she knew what the HOA now knew too late. She hadn't just saved her home. She'd drawn a boundary they would never again dare to cross. The thaw began in subtle ways. It wasn't the snow melting from the rooflines or the way the icicles dripped rhythmically from mailboxes. It was in the conversations, the sidelong glances exchanged at community gatherings, the questions whispered behind closed doors. It was in the way the residents of Greystone Pines began to speak Helen Ward's name not with pity or polite acknowledgement, but with admiration. Some said she was lucky. Others said she was clever. But all of them agreed on one thing. She had done what no one else had dared. She had stood up to the HOA and walked away stronger for it. Helen, for her part, hadn't set out to become a symbol. She wasn't interested in being the face of a movement or the subject of gossip. Her world remained largely unchanged. Mornings began with strong tea and the crossword. Afternoons in the garden or at her desk revisiting an old memoir she'd been editing on and off for years. She still baked twice a week, and she still volunteered at the library on Saturdays. But her once quiet life had acquired a current of attention, a magnetism that drew neighbors to her porch with homemade jam and cautious questions. Some came seeking advice. Others came with confessions, and a few, like Marla Bickford from Sycamore Lane, came with folders stuffed with HOA fines, all of them circled in red ink and labeled arbitrary. Marla sat on Helen's porch one blustery morning with a thermos of coffee between them, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she recounted her ordeal. "They said my shutters were the wrong shade of green," she muttered, her voice low, "and that my driveway needed to be resurfaced. Never mind that it's concrete and pristine. I've paid nearly $800 in fines over the last 2 years, Helen, and I have no idea where that money goes." Helen listened, nodding occasionally, her expression unreadable. She had heard variations of Marla's story half a dozen times now, each one peeling back another layer of the HOA's veneer. The pattern was always the same: enforcement without transparency, penalties without oversight, control wielded under the guise of community standards. What had started with her road had turned into something much larger, a reckoning, slow and inevitable. She asked Marla for her documents and promised to look them over. That evening, after finishing her supper and feeding Whiskers, Helen laid out the papers on her dining table and examined them line by line. She cross-referenced the fine notices with the HOA's own bylaws, noting inconsistencies, vague language, and fee structures that seemed designed less for maintenance and more for revenue. She highlighted section after section, her pen gliding across the paper with the precision of someone used to dissecting municipal codes and engineering contracts. What she found disturbed her. There were violations issued with no photographs, citations sent without appeal instructions, and entire line items in the HOA budget labeled only as community improvement reserves, with no explanation of where the money actually went. She flagged it all and filed it into a new binder she labeled HOA Review. And then, for the first time since her confrontation with the board, Helen made a deliberate choice. She went public. The next day, Helen attended the monthly community meeting. She hadn't gone in over a year, not since the agenda had been reduced to lawn complaints and landscaping vendor reviews. But this time, she walked into the clubhouse with her binder in hand and her back straight. The room fell quiet as she entered, eyes following her as she made her way to the front and took a seat in the second row. Victoria Lang, still clutching her gavel like a life preserver, stiffened at the sight of her. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries: financials, committee reports, the landscaping update. But when the floor opened for resident comments, Helen stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture wildly or demand attention. She simply began to speak. "I'd like to talk about the fines," she said, "and the fee structure, and the lack of transparency in our annual budget. I've reviewed the last 3 years of board communications, budget filings, and bylaw enforcement records. What I've found is deeply concerning." She opened her binder and began to read. She spoke for 15 minutes, uninterrupted. She presented documented examples of residents fined without cause, highlighted ambiguities in the bylaws, and questioned unaccounted for spending listed under vague labels. She concluded not with accusations, but with a proposal: the formation of an independent review committee made up of homeowners unaffiliated with the current board, tasked with auditing finances and rewriting portions of the bylaws to reflect fairness, clarity, and due process. There was silence when she finished. Long, heavy silence. Then someone clapped, one hesitant pair of hands in the back of the room. Another joined in. Then more. Within moments, the room erupted in applause. Victoria banged her gavel, her face flushed, her composure fraying at the edges. "Mrs. Ward, this is not an appropriate forum." "With all due respect, Madam Chair," Helen said, turning slowly to face her, "this is exactly the forum. Because we are the community, not just the board. And we deserve to understand where our money goes and how our rules are applied." A motion was made to vote on Helen's proposal. Victoria attempted to table it, but the vote passed unanimously. The review committee was formed that same evening. Helen was asked to lead it. She declined. "I'm not here to run things," she said, smiling gently, "just to make sure things run right." Over the weeks that followed, the committee worked diligently. They opened the HOA's books and found more irregularities. Overpriced vendor contracts awarded without competitive bids. Thousands spent on consulting fees to a firm with ties to a board member's spouse. A reserve fund depleted with no record of what the money had been used for. The committee published a report. It was 56 pages long, thorough, and devastating. When it was distributed to residents, there was no outrage, just quiet, stunned disbelief that such mismanagement had gone unnoticed for so long. Victoria resigned within days. Derek followed. One board member left the state entirely. A special election was held. New members were voted in, pragmatic, respectful neighbors who promised transparency and accountability. The atmosphere of fear and enforcement lifted almost overnight. Fines stopped. Homeowners smiled more. People began to speak freely again. And in the middle of it all, Helen remained unchanged, still tending her garden, still writing, still sipping her tea with whiskers curled at her feet. But something had changed inside her too. She no longer felt like a woman on the margins of her own neighborhood. She no longer felt quietly dismissed or politely ignored. She had spoken up. She had held the line. And others had followed, not out of admiration, but out of recognition. Because Helen Ward reminded them all that dignity, knowledge, and quiet strength still meant something. Her road remained unpaved. Her shutters remained blue. And her home, still standing at the dead end of Wren Hollow Court, had become something more than a structure. It had become a symbol of resistance, of reason, and of a community that had finally found its voice. Helen woke early the morning after the special election, the pale winter sun filtering through the frost-covered windows of her small brick cottage. She stretched slowly, feeling the familiar ache in her joints, the quiet creak of bones that had weathered nearly 70 winters. She reached for her robe, the thick woolen one her late husband had given her on their last anniversary, and padded quietly into the kitchen, where the smell of freshly ground coffee filled the air. She poured herself a cup, added a splash of cream, and sat at the small wooden table that had served as her command center for the past few months. Outside, the snow had settled into a thick, undisturbed blanket, softening the hard edges of the world and muffling the sounds of early morning traffic. It reminded her of the way the neighborhood had felt in those first weeks after the board had resigned, when the air had seemed lighter, the silences less tense. People had begun walking their dogs again, lingering at the mailboxes for friendly chats instead of hurriedly retreating into their garages. The change had been subtle at first, but unmistakable, a slow, steady thaw of fear and resentment. Helen sipped her coffee, her eyes drifting to the stack of documents still piled neatly on the corner of the table. She had promised herself she would put them away, that she would close this chapter and move on, but something kept pulling her back, a nagging sense that her work was not yet done. She reached for the top folder, her fingers brushing against the cool, crisp paper as she flipped it open to the first page. It was the financial audit she had helped draft for the new board, a comprehensive, line-by-line accounting of every dollar the HOA had collected and spent over the past decade. She had insisted on transparency, on accountability, on a full reckoning of the board's actions, and the new members had complied, their reluctance slowly giving way to respect as they realized the depth of her commitment and the clarity of her vision. The report had been mailed to every homeowner in the community, its pages filled with charts and graphs and carefully worded explanations, each one a quiet rebuke to the old guard's arrogance and neglect. Helen closed the folder and set it aside, her gaze drifting to the window as a pair of cardinals flitted through the bare branches of the oak tree outside. She felt a flicker of satisfaction, a deep, quiet warmth that spread through her chest like the first sip of whiskey on a cold night. She had done it. She had taken on the HOA, exposed their corruption, and reclaimed her home, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt small or powerless in the face of petty authority. She had reminded her neighbors that they were not just residents, but owners, not just dues payers, but citizens. And in doing so, she had reminded herself of something she had almost forgotten, that she was still strong, still sharp, still capable of fighting for what she believed in. As she sat there, the morning light slowly creeping across the table, Helen felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing for her husband. She reached for the framed photo that sat beside the sugar bowl, her fingers brushing lightly over the glass as she traced the familiar lines of his face. He had always been the fighter, the one with the fire in his belly and the steel in his spine, but in his absence, she had discovered that she, too, had a core of iron, a quiet, unyielding strength that had carried her through 100 small battles and one great war. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She set the photo down and crossed the small living room, her slippers whispering against the polished hardwood as she reached for the brass doorknob. She opened the door to find Marla Bickford standing on the porch, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her breath puffing white in the icy air. "Helen," Marla said, her voice trembling slightly. The weather from nerves or the bitter wind, Helen couldn't tell. "I'm sorry to bother you, but, well, some of us were talking, and we thought maybe you should come down to the clubhouse. There's something you ought to see." Helen frowned, her fingers tightening on the edge of the doorframe. She had spent the better part of a year fighting her way into that building, breaking down barriers and tearing up old assumptions, but the thought of returning now, after everything, filled her with a strange, uneasy dread. She hesitated, her mind racing through a dozen possible scenarios, each one more unsettling than the last. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that shot through her veins. "Give me a minute to grab my coat." She dressed quickly, pulling on her thick woolen sweater and the heavy down parka she reserved for the coldest days of winter. She slipped her feet into her snow boots, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped out into the crisp, biting air, her breath fogging the air in front of her as she followed Marla down the long, winding drive that led to the clubhouse. As they approached, Helen saw a small crowd gathered outside, their faces upturned, their eyes fixed on the front of the building. She slowed, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized what they were looking at. The old, faded sign that had once read Greystone Pines Community Center had been replaced. In its place, a new, hand-carved wooden plaque hung proudly above the double doors, its polished surface gleaming in the pale winter sunlight. The letters were bold and clean, the words etched deeply into the grain. "Helen Ward Community Center." Helen stopped, her breath catching in her throat, her gloved hand flying to her mouth as the full weight of the gesture hit her. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, her vision blurring as the crowd slowly parted to let her through. She stepped forward, her boots crunching over the snow as she reached out to touch the polished wood, her fingers trembling as they traced the familiar lines of her own name. She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping over the gathered faces, the quiet, respectful smiles, the grateful nods and tear-streaked cheeks. She saw Marla, her husband beside her, their hands clasped tightly together. She saw Sam, the retired firefighter who had once raged against the HOA's ban on flagpoles. She saw the young couple from Maple Street, their toddler perched on his father's shoulders, his tiny hands clapping in silent, innocent joy. "Thank you," Helen whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as she met their eyes, one by one. "Thank you all." And as the first snowflakes of a fresh storm began to drift down from the gray winter sky, Helen Ward stood before the building that now bore her name, a woman transformed by her own quiet defiance, her place in the community finally, undeniably secure.